Hi, I'm Mike Shea from SlyFlourish.com, and I'm the author of Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. And today we're going to talk about how and when to use maps in your D&D game. This video is intended for people who might be new or newer to D&D, newer to running D&D, or if you're a DM who is teaching D&D to a new player and you want to figure out when and how you should bring maps into the situation. In the adventure, in the D&D Essentials Kit, a new box that's intended to bring players into D&D, there is a book and an adventure called The Dragon of Ice Spire Peak. And in this particular book, they have a small description that I wanted to start with, where they describe when and how to use maps. And they say, I'm not going to read it. Well, I guess I will read it aloud. Maps that appear in this book are for the DM's eyes only. A map not only shows an adventure location in its entirety, but also shows secret doors, hidden traps, and other elements that the players aren't meant to see, hence the secrecy. When the characters arrive at a location marked on a map, you can either rely on a verbal description to give them a clear mental picture of the location, or you can draw what they see on a piece of graph paper, copying what's on your map while omitting details as appropriate. It's not important that your hand-drawn map perfectly match what is printed in the adventure. Focus on getting the shape and dimensions correct and leave the rest to the player's imagination. I think that is excellent advice. And I think that when we are thinking about maps, that we should start at the lowest common denominator for maps. That our goal should be focusing on the story of D&D as much as possible, and using as few tools as we can to be able to share the game, tell the story, share the story, and enjoy the game, and then use maps when we need them. And I think that the idea and that's a hard point. Like, when exactly do you need to use a visual diagram? So a lot of times, if a situation is simple, if there is a hallway that is going up to a pair of double doors, then you don't really need to draw that out. You can say you're in a hallway, it's about 15 feet high, 10 feet wide, goes about 30 feet down, and at the end of the hall, you see a pair of large stone doors with mosaics of grinning dwarves that are cloaked and hooded and grinning at you, right? And you're like, wow, okay, I don't need to draw that. But then if you say beyond the doors is a room, there are 4 hallways, two that lead off to the north. I'm sorry, 2 that lead off to the east, 1 that leads north, and 1 that leads south. There is a large altar in the center of the hall on the eastern side and a dais that leads up. You're like, that's like 12 things, right? That's a point where you might need to mention it. So an example of such map would be that the ones I actually just described come from the the quest in this book called the Dwarven Excavation. So if you look at this map, you have this sort of hallway with the grinning statues and the dais. This area is not particularly hard to describe. Right, so you go through big walls, there's a hall, there's a set of doors, right? Now you might say, well, there's a hallway that leads off to the north, right? So showing this or diagramming, the minute you probably have 2 or 3 exits on a place is not a bad time to start sketching things out. And then when you get to a larger room like this, and this is one where there's a lot happening in this room, particularly considering the fact that there are secret doors. So I'm making the assumption that you see the secret doors, but you could say you go into an altar and you don't see any secret doors. You just see pillars. So you can describe this. And I think starting with the description, and the minute you start to see players have trouble understanding, the minute they say like, where are the halls again? That's probably the time to sit down and draw it. And the easiest way and the cheapest way is pull out a sheet of paper and a pen or a pencil and draw it on a sheet of paper and a pen and pencil. That seems so basic, but I think for a lot of DMs that have played for a lot of years, I think I did that for nearly 20 years of playing D&D. I drew stuff on a piece of paper. And you don't need anything more than a piece of paper and a pen. Anybody that's like, oh, you need battle maps, you need miniatures, you need all this stuff. You don't. And that's actually a pretty big barrier to play D&D if you start requiring all that stuff. So the idea that, you have what you need in this D&D Essentials Kit, and really all you need is to be able to draw it on a piece of paper is a really good start. And the question is, at what point do you switch over to drawing? And it really gets to that point where the minute the players are having trouble understanding the positioning, And when you're having trouble understanding the positioning, sketch it out. And you can even sketch out like, here's where the gray ooze is, and here's where you are, and here's where the line that you drew, the line that you shot to try to get over the floor without touching it. That's where it goes. The minute the players are having trouble understanding it, that's when it's time to draw it out. One question is about scale. How important is scale? I will argue you don't really need to worry about being very accurate to the original map. Instead, it's all about positioning. You want to make sure the hallways connect correctly. You want to make sure that the room looks roughly big enough to match the room that they're in. But the idea of making sure, they mentioned graph paper, and this is certainly how people did it for a long time. I'd argue you don't really have to get close to the graph. That it's more important to show the general positioning of things than it is to show the specific amounts of distance that are between this. We call those the 5-foot squares. And it's not that important to show every 5-foot square. It's more important to show general positioning, just so everybody has an idea of where things are going. Now, there is a tool, and I think it is probably, in my opinion, the number one most useful aid that you can have for D&D outside of all of the things you absolutely need to play. So you need your books, you need your dice, you need pen and pencils, you need character sheets, you need stuff like that. And those are really kind of required. There's ways that you can get around some of those things. You can play on your phone, you can play with digital devices, stuff like that. But generally speaking, you're going to need those tools. The one other tool that I argue people need, the Pathfinder Basic Flip Mat. It is inexpensive. It's $13 on Amazon. And it has gray stone on one side, and it has sort of sand on the other. And this is a fold-up dry or wet erase battle map. It is about, I think it's 24 by 36 inches, and it is folded into 3 by 3. So it folds up to about an 8 by 10, which means it's very easy to carry around. It's really lightweight. And you can draw on it with dry erase markers. Now, it is gridded, so you can get pretty specific about how detailed a map. I would argue don't worry about the grid too much. Just draw what's going on. But the nice thing is you can set this out on the table in front of you when your game starts and leave it blank. And then anytime you need to write anything down, if you need to write down the hit points of monsters, if you want to draw the kind of symbol that they see on a wall, if you want to draw, the side view of a mountain, anything that you want to draw, you can quickly sketch on this as though it was a great big whiteboard. It's just a whiteboard that's sitting in front of you that you can easily fold up and put up. So of all of the tools, obviously pen and paper works really well, but I'm a huge fan of the Pathfinder Flip Mat and a set of dry erase markers. I carry one in my kit almost everywhere I go. And it's really, really useful to be able to draw everything out. Now, a trick for this is draw quickly. No one really wants to sit around watching you draw a battle mat or a really detailed room. And I did an interview with a friend of mine who is blind. And she said, like, the worst thing in the world is when she's playing D&D and having fun, and the DM stops to draw a battle mat, and she's sitting there, and she's like, it's not going to be useful to me anyway. And now I got to sit here waiting around for him to draw a mat that isn't useful for me, right? So drawing it quickly can really help. Some will make the valid argument that you should pre-draw stuff, and I think that can be useful if you've got a room like that altar we were showing before. You might say, okay, we're going to go ahead and draw that out ahead of time. That way you can get all the pillars right, you can get the altar right, but you can sketch this pretty quickly too. And I think it's useful because we don't know when we necessarily need to sketch everything, you might sketch 1 or 2 rooms, but keep the rest of it, just draw it quickly. And again, you're not going for accuracy and detail. You're going for speed and to make sure that people understand the relative positioning of things. This isn't about making sure you get it exactly whatever it is, 7 squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 squares high and 9 squares wide. Just it doesn't matter that much. You just want to draw out the room, draw it as a square. You don't have to get all the angles right, and then make sure that you can identify the positioning. Now, for identifying characters and monsters, again, if you have a dry erasable board like a Pathfinder Flip Mat, you can just put like the first initial of the character down on the mat wherever they are. Same thing for the monsters. You could put like an M1 and an M2 or G1 for the gray ooze and G2 for the other gray ooze. And then when they move, you just take your thumb and you wipe it off and you draw them in the new place where they go. And you can think of it like a football play mat, right? You just move wherever you're managing your football plays, and you just move the things around and draw them out. And then on the other side, you might have how much damage they took. So that's a really quick way to draw both characters and monsters on the mat and show their positioning. And again, it's probably pretty close, considering that like it's probably $15 for the flip mat and dry erase markers, and that's something you'll use. Like I think I've had my flip mat for like at least 10 years. So now the markers you got to go through. So you constantly have to get new dry erase markers because they tend to dry out. But it's a pretty cheap way in this hobby to be able to represent physical locations and characters and monsters. It's probably, and it's a very flexible way. You can draw anything. I ran a battle the other day where there was a bunch of there was a Sahuagin priestess riding on the back of a killer whale. Well, guess what? I don't have a miniature of a killer whale. So I just drew a whale. Right. And then, there it was. And everybody understood, so that's where the whale is. And that's where the Sahuagin priestess is, and we're swimming up on this side. So they understood the positioning, and it was all set just because we had it. So I didn't have to go find a killer whale miniature in order to do that. And that really gets into the last part of this conversation, which is what about miniatures and terrain? So this is another area that can scale up pretty much infinitely. And that's the danger of it. The dirty secret of miniatures is you never have the right ones or as many of them as you need, no matter how big your mini collection is. Nobody has exactly what they need at any given time. And if you've got a lot of miniatures, and many people who have been playing this game for a long time have a lot more than, they have literally thousands of miniatures. Now they have to go through thousands of miniatures to find the ones they need when they need it. And that takes time. It either takes time during preparation, and then you're also assuming that the players are going to go, the characters are going to go where they go, and that you're going to need exactly that many miniatures. But it also can take time during the game to go pull them out. Even if you've separated them out, you still kind of have to go through them and figure them out. Adding miniatures adds a lot of time to your prep, a little bit to a lot of time during your gameplay. Certainly a high cost, because miniatures are not cheap. Some of the cheapest way to get miniatures, you're still talking at least hundreds of dollars. Now there's some options like flat plastic miniatures and other printable miniatures, and those work really well. They cut back on the amount of money, but they don't necessarily cut back on the amount of time it takes to the amount of time it takes to get them set up and everything like that. So that can be tricky. But people still like minis. Now, I would argue one really good area for minis is for the characters, particularly if you can get your players to sort of invest in their character. So the Wizkids, the company Wizkids, has partnered with both Paizo, the people who run Pathfinder, and Wizards of the Coast, the people who run Dungeons and Dragons, and they have lots and lots of unpainted character miniatures that you can buy in a blister pack for about $5. I think they run about $3 to $5 depending on where you get them, and you usually get about 2 miniatures per pack. And there are so many of them that you can really custom. You can customize your character by picking out which one of those minis best represents your character. And if a player buys a character mini, that's one they will hold on to for a long time. They'll hold it through the entire campaign. So they'll, and many times a player will go ahead and make that $3 to $5 investment. As a DM, you could suggest that the player spend the $3 to $5 in order to get a mini. Maybe somebody in the group is actually pretty good at painting minis and likes it, and they would actually sit and paint the minis for people. I've seen that happen too. And then you have a nice pre-painted miniature for your character for that campaign. And that means you don't have to draw the first initial of the character on the mat whenever you're doing the mat. You can still do it for monsters. No one really cares about the gray ooze, right? They care about, Barandar, the dwarven fighter, but they don't really care about the gray ooze. So Barandar has a nice miniature, and the gray ooze, you just write G, on the map where the gray ooze is. And that way, if there's like 14 gray oozes and you're like, man, I don't have 14 gray ooze minis, you can just do G, 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 G all over your map, and you got all your gray oozes. And I think I did that. I think I had 100 slimes at one point. And I just said like all the slimes are around here, right? So that is a trick. If you get into monster minis, that's when you start to fall down the slippery slope of, wow, I run all the ones that are in the monster manual, and then I need all of the ones that, how many gnolls? How many gnolls are enough? And I can tell you, so I have a huge miniatures collection that I've kept for many years, and I'm not getting rid of it anytime soon. And they're all well organized. I have all of my most common ones upstairs where I play. I have a bunch of ones that I don't generally use down below, and I've spent enough time with them that I kind of know which ones I have and which ones I don't, and roughly where they are. But I'll tell you, there are times where it's like, man, I need 3 bullets and I only have 2, and I think I might have a third. I'm going to go down in the archive and go dig one up, and I can't find it. And then it's like, oh. If you're just getting started, I'd recommend starting again with as little stuff as possible, and then adding things as you need them, right? And another realm for miniatures that people started getting into is 3D printing miniatures. And then you're like, well, then I can have as many as I want. There's still a lot of time involved, and you still have that situation of like the players end up not going where you think they're going to go, and then you're off. The final topic I want to talk about is terrain. On top of a blank battle mat, like the Paizo or the Pathfinder battle mat, there are also pre-printed battle mats. Both Wizards of the Coast and Paizo make pre-printed battle maps. So Wizards of the Coast has made a set of battle maps called the D&D Tactical Maps Reincarnated. And they're pretty cheap. They're $18, and there's a whole bunch of different kinds. There's roads, and there's villages, and there's ruined villages, and there's altars and shrines, and there's dragon lairs. There's all different kinds. So if you have these on hand and you happen to know that the players are going to go to one of these areas, having a pre-printed map of the area, it's going to look a lot better than it will if you are just quickly hand sketching something on a blank battle mat with a single black dry erase marker. But again, it's sort of an investment. This is cheaper, like $18 isn't so bad, and you can't write on them, not if they're paper. The Paizo ones you can dry erase on, but they also cost more. I think you have to pay that same about $12 or $14 per map with two sides of whatever location. So they ship maps. But if you're careful, you can go buy the exact maps you think you're generally going to need, like a cave area, a temple, a dungeon. You know, there's a set of probably about 8: a forest, a road, a village. There's a bunch of different pre-printed maps you can get for general locations that will probably work better than you trying to hand draw anything. So that is another option that leads there. And then there's also the wide world of 3D terrain. This is really the high-end area of D&D, and I would argue it's almost its own separate hobby. I am a big fan of it. I support. So my favorite company that does this is a company called Dwarven Forge. So Dwarven Forge makes really beautiful tabletop terrain, dungeon terrain, or villages or castles or caves. And the cost is really high. This is well beyond the $12 of a flip mat, but you can make some really beautiful layouts. Again, I would consider this almost a separate hobby. It's really cool stuff, and it's a lot of fun. It won't necessarily make the story of your D&D game any better than if you just describe things or quickly sketch it out on a map. Having run hundreds of D&D games, I can tell you that when I've used Dwarven Forge or not has not been a factor in how good a game, how much enjoyment the players have gotten from a game. We like this stuff, and it's a lot of fun to see, and there's a lot of wow factor when you put it on the table. But the direct effect it has on the overall story of the game does not account for the cost. And the cost is still worth it for really cool stuff. But if you think that your game is going to be that much better because of this stuff, the answer is there's a lot of other things you can do for free that will probably make your game a lot better than investing heavily in 3D terrain, and I would argue in miniatures as well. In conclusion, I would argue that the best way to get involved with how to use maps at your game is to start by just describing the situation and see how far you can get with just verbal descriptions. When you get into complicated areas, take out a piece of paper and a pencil and draw it out that way. If you want a tool that's a little bit more universal and useful, the Paizo Flip Mat is a really good way to go. It's very cheap. It's very, very useful, very powerful tool to use, and can get you running games for a long time, and it is a really excellent tool. I highly recommend it. If you want to get into miniatures, focus on getting miniatures that represent the player characters first. And if you get into monsters, be careful that you're going down a slippery slope, and you have to accept the fact that you're never going to have all of the monster miniatures that you need to represent any given situation you have. If you want to get into the high end of D&D, take a look at Dwarven Forge terrain. It's really cool terrain. It's really a separate hobby. And while it's a lot of fun to play with, it isn't necessarily going to make your game that much better. There's a lot of things you can do in order to make your game a lot more enjoyable for your players that doesn't require a heavy investment in terrain or in miniatures. I hope this video is useful. If you enjoyed this video, please take a look at my book, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, or subscribe to my YouTube channel and see other tips like this, and get out there and play some D&D. Thank you very much.